comrades. This is the Finnish Bolshevik. I used to be called Marxist-Leninist propaganda, but if you've seen my previous video on this on Red Scare TV, you know that I was contemplating changing my channel name. So my new channel name is The Finnish Bolshevik, because it's, and also I thought that that way I could better get the attention of Finnish communists from you know, when I'm doing my stuff on YouTube. So if you are a communist or interested in communism, and if you are from Finland, then you know, get in touch with me. Anyway, let's get to the actual point. For those of you who don't know, I also have a blog, which I don't really post stuff there very often, but nevertheless I do have a blog, and I made a blog post yesterday, and I'm gonna be using that as my script for this video. So if you want to take a look at that, then the link should be in the description for the actual text version. So the topic for today is the so-called Lenin's Testament. The title of the blog post was "The so-called Lenin's Testament and Trotskyist Anti-Communist Mythology," but that's quite a long title. But anyway, let's get right to it. So firstly, Lenin's Testament. One of the most frequent arguments that Trotskyists use against Marxist-Leninists is that in his so-called testament, Lenin supposedly ordered Stalin to be removed from his post as General Secretary. It is also often claimed that Lenin even wanted Stalin to be replaced by Trotsky as the future leader of the party. So that is what Trotskyists say. Actually, this couldn't be further from the truth, but first and foremost, let's see what Lenin actually said. Because this is the thing that Trotskyists always quote. Like, I was just talking to Mason about this yesterday, how like Trotskyists, they don't really quote Lenin at all, but there's this one thing they always quote, which is the so-called Lenin's Testament, the thing they call Lenin's Testament, and it is the following quote, basically. Quote, "Stalin is too rude, and this defect, although quite tolerable in our midst and in dealing among us communists, becomes intolerable in a Secretary General. That is why I suggest that the comrades think about a way of removing Stalin from that post and appointing another man in his stead who in all other respects differs from Comrade Stalin in having only one advantage, namely that of being more tolerant, more loyal, more polite, and more considerate." So that is Lenin, and it's from addition to the second letter to Congress. The thing that usually is referred to as Lenin's quote-unquote testament, that is actually his several letters that he wrote, or rather dictated, to the Bolshevik Congress. Pay close attention to what is actually said in the quote. So first of all, Stalin is too rude, and secondly, that he should be replaced by some hypothetical person who is identical to him except less rude. It is important to understand that 1. Lenin had no dictatorial control over this issue. The letter was merely a suggestion. The Congress considered, so it wasn't an order, because Lenin didn't have any kind of power to order that kind of decision. The Congress considered Lenin's suggestion, but voted in favor of keeping Stalin in his post. Even Trotsky and Zinoviev voted in Stalin's favor on this. As Trotsky himself pointed out, so this is a quote from Trotsky, "Congress devoted the greatest attention to this and to the other letters, and drew the appropriate conclusions." End of quote. So more about that later. 2. Stalin was the General Secretary, but not the leader of the party, as Trotskyists sometimes claim. Lenin was the leader of the party, so Lenin didn't want Stalin to be removed from the position of party leader, because he wasn't the party's leader, because Lenin was the leader. 3. Lenin said nothing about putting Trotsky in Stalin's place as leader or as the General Secretary or anything like that. The idea that Lenin wanted Trotsky to replace Stalin as quote-unquote the leader was introduced by an American Trotskyist, Max Eastman, in his book, which we'll get to a little bit later. It's a myth. This is what Trotsky himself said about the book. Quote, Eastman is again wrong in asserting that Comrade Lenin offered me the post of chairman of the Council of People's Commissars and of the Council of Labor and Defense. I hear of this for the first time in Eastman's book, and this is from Trotsky letter on Eastman's book. 4. Lenin only suggested that Stalin should be removed from his post as the General Secretary, but didn't say a word about him being removed from any other posts, or from the Central Committee, or from the Politburo, or anything like that, just the General Secretary. And this is slightly confusing, but because Stalin later became the leader of the party, but the post of the General Secretary isn't really like the post of the leader, because Lenin was the leader, but Stalin was already the General Secretary while Lenin was alive. So the post of the General Secretary really has nothing to do with being the leader of the party. So the first conclusion we can draw from this: Lenin did not want Stalin to be removed from positions of power or be replaced by Trotsky. That's a complete myth. He complained about Stalin's rudeness, but said that he should be replaced by someone that's identical but less rude. Such a person didn't exist apart from Stalin himself. So the obvious question to ask would be, why exactly did Lenin suggest Stalin's removal from this particular post, and what is this stuff about rudeness? Well, in 1922, Lenin had a stroke and was forced to stop political work. He continued writing and even wrote significant works such as On Cooperation, which argued in favor of the possibility of building socialism in one country. However, his condition deteriorated. He had another stroke and was confined to a wheelchair. He still tried to keep in touch with politics and dictated several letters and other documents until he eventually lost the ability to speak. And in case you don't know, he died in January 1924. But what is this, all this stuff about rudeness? Like, why does that matter? Well, Stalin was made responsible for Lenin's health by the Central Committee, which included at the time Stalin, Trotsky, Dzerzhinsky, Kalinin, Molotov, Bukharin, Zinoviev, and a whole host of other people. The doctors ordered that Lenin was not to be involved in politics because he had to avoid stress. So he was also prohibited from reading political documents or anything like that because it was bad for his health, which was, he was in a very serious condition. So Lenin didn't like this at all, although he jokingly said to Stalin, and this is a quote, "I'm not allowed to read the newspapers, and I must not talk politics. I carefully avoid every scrap of paper lying on the table, lest it turn out to be a newspaper and lead to a breach of discipline." That's from Comrade Lenin on Vacation Notes. So, he was joking about it, but he didn't really like it at all. So, as his condition worsened, he grew more agitated and frustrated, which is, perfectly understandable. I mean, he just couldn't bear to just sit still and do nothing. So Stalin was constantly there, making sure that he wasn't doing political work, which, of course annoyed Lenin. So Lenin eventually asked his wife, Krupskaya, and his sister, Maria Ulyanova, to start smuggling him political documents, which they did against the doctor's orders, because he wasn't allowed to, be involved in politics for health reasons. So they started to smuggle him these documents because he wanted to be involved. So it's quite probable that this is the reason why Lenin was so agitated with Stalin, and probably emotionally unstable due to his severe condition. This is not just my opinion, I'll get to the actual evidence later. Note that the part where Lenin criticizes Stalin's rudeness was a later addition to the second letter. He wrote, I think, 4 letters and then some other documents. In the original letter he said nothing about Stalin's rudeness, so it was something he added several months later. Having known Stalin for years, it seems odd that he would suddenly become so concerned about his rudeness, if you don't take into account that he was seriously ill. So I think it's worthwhile to hear the opinion of Lenin's sister Maria on this, because I think this clears up a lot of this confusion. So this is a quote from Lenin's sister from 1926. Quote, "There was an incident between Lenin and Stalin which Comrade Zinoviev mentions in his speech, and which took place not long before Ilyich lost," so Ilyich is Lenin, "lost his power of speech. March 1923. But it was completely personal and had nothing to do with politics. Comrade Zinoviev knew this very well, and to quote it was absolutely unnecessary. This incident took place because, on the demand of the doctors, the Central Committee gave Stalin the charge of keeping a watch so that no political news reached Lenin during his period of serious illness. This was done so as not to upset him and so that his condition did not deteriorate. He, Stalin, even scolded his family for conveying this type of information. Ilyich, who accidentally came to know about this and who was also always worried about such a strong regime of protection, in turn scolded Stalin. Stalin apologized, and with this the incident was settled. What is there to be said? During this period, as I had indicated, if Lenin had not been so seriously ill, then he would have reacted to the incident differently. There are documents regarding this incident, and on the first demand of the Central Committee I can present them. This way I affirm that all talk of the opposition about Lenin's relations towards Stalin does not correspond to reality. These relations were most intimate and friendly and remained so. So that is what Lenin's sister said, and I am compelled to believe what she said, because she was probably the most objective source imaginable for this. It is worth noting that Krupskaya, Lenin's wife, was a long-time comrade of Stalin's, but at the time she was a supporter of Zinoviev, although not a supporter of Trotsky. So here's Krupskaya on Trotsky in 1925. Quote, Marxist analysis was never Comrade Trotsky's strong point. End of quote. And then there's a second quote. When such a comrade as Trotsky treads, even unconsciously, the path of revision of Leninism, then the party must make a pronouncement. This is from the Lessons of October. It's from a pamphlet called The Errors of Trotskyism. It's worth noting that Zinoviev and Kamenev vacillated between Trotskyism and Leninism, and in 1925 they opposed Trotsky, while in 1926 they moved to Trotsky's side, and then they abandoned him again in 1927. So the second conclusion we can draw is that it's very probable that Lenin only criticized Stalin due to his severe illness, as his sister said. It's very likely that this illness led him to be overly concerned about Stalin's real or imaginary rudeness. Because, you know, as Lenin's sister pointed out, like, Stalin harshly criticized Lenin's wife. I mean, she just talked about, you know, Lenin's family, but really she was talking about Lenin's wife. Stalin criticized her with strong words because, you know, she was giving Lenin political documents and newspapers and stuff against the doctor's orders. Also, despite the fact that Krupskaya wasn't a supporter of Stalin at the time, she was not a supporter of Trotsky either. So there's this idea floating around that Krupskaya really hated Stalin and Stalin really hated Krupskaya. That's not really true at all. She was actually much more supportive of Stalin than Trotsky, whom she openly and sharply criticized, for example in the pamphlet The Errors of Trotskyism. In fact, Krupskaya was eventually convinced of the correctness of Stalin's policy. So this is another quote. This is from Why is the Second International Defending Trotsky? This is from Krupskaya. Quote, the masses can see how completely, tirelessly Comrade Stalin is giving himself to the sacred work, the work of Lenin, the building of socialism, how he is carrying them forward towards a better life. Everybody can see that, and they believe him. He is surrounded by their trust and love. The Trotskyites and Zinovievs did not think about the masses. They were not living in reality. They were thinking only about how to capture power. End of quote. Not to mention that Krupskaya and Stalin had been comrades in the party for decades. Prior to this, Krupskaya had praised Stalin's earlier works, defending Lenin, for example, briefly about the disagreements in the party and socialism or anarchism. She only sided against Stalin on this one issue for a relatively short period of time, so it's not like they just, you know, had this long-running, like, hatred of each other. No, it was just this one incident, because, you know, she just happened to share the opinion of Zinoviev on this one debate, and then she just happened to be the one to smuggle Lenin these documents. I didn't choose to quote any of the other documents, but Lenin himself, like, he wrote Stalin an angry letter about this, where he says that, you know, Stalin has to apologize to Krupskaya, but he says in the letter that that Krupskaya was willing to forget all about it, that that Lenin himself did not hear about this whole incident from Krupskaya at all. He heard about this from Zinoviev. But anyway, that's kind of beside the point. 2. Origin of the Testament mythology. So this is the second part of the video in which I deal with a related but somewhat different issue. Modern Trotskyism and right-wing anti-communist propaganda both consider it to be an established fact that 1. Trotsky was Lenin's rightful successor, 2. that Lenin indicated this in a testament, 3. and that Stalin banned and concealed this testament. In fact, none of those claims are true. Like, seriously, none of them are true at all. As we already established, Lenin said nothing about Stalin being removed from positions of power, only about, him being removed from this administrative post of General Secretary. He said nothing about Trotsky's power being increased, and it's questionable how serious he really was about Stalin being replaced by anyone as General Secretary, because he said that the person should be identical to Stalin, but like exactly as good except less rude, and such a person didn't really exist. And it's also, everybody kinda at the time seemed to think that Lenin wasn't really, didn't really mean what he said, because he was just so tense. I mean, that just seems to be the consensus. I mean, even his sister thought that, and she probably, knew what she was talking about. Anyway, these rumors, or rather lies and slander, so those 3 things that I mentioned, they do have a source. They're not just, we actually kind of know where they came from. So all of them can be traced back to a book by the American Trotskyist Max Eastman, who I mentioned earlier. So conveniently for us, Trotsky himself refuted every single one of these lies, although later he himself began spreading those lies, and most Trotskyists today probably learned these falsehoods from Trotsky's autobiography and accept them as gospel truth without any kind of critical examination of the actual facts. But in any case, they are pure fiction, as you will soon find out. So, soon after Lenin's death, rumors about Eastman's scandalous book began circulating. To Soviet communists, the information in Eastman's book was completely obviously false, and of course everybody in the Soviet Union knew the reality of the situation, so it wasn't convincing. And because Eastman was a devout and well-known Trotskyist, Mr. Leon Trotsky himself was kind of forced to respond to Eastman. He had no choice but to distance himself from Eastman's anti-Soviet and unconvincing lies, because, you can imagine that if Trotsky is in the opposition, and then there's this guy who really loudly proclaims that he's a supporter of Trotsky, and then he says something completely stupid, of course it's gonna make Trotsky look really bad, so Trotsky had to respond to him. So Trotsky originally refuted every single one of Eastman's lies, but he later himself began spreading the exact same lies in his own writings. So the following section is going to seem somewhat schizophrenic, because I'll be quoting Trotsky from 1925 and 1928, so 3 years different, and you'll notice that he's saying the completely polar opposite things, contradicting himself at every turn. It's kind of ridiculous. So without further ado, allow me to present Trotsky Debates Trotsky. So yeah, this is kind of hilarious actually. It's kind of crazy. So this is I'll be quoting Trotsky from his letter on Eastman's book from 1925, and then from Trotsky on Max Eastman 1928. This is from Trotsky letter on Eastman's book 1925. Quote, Eastman's book, to which you refer, is unknown to me. The bourgeois newspapers that quoted it have not reached me. Of course, I deny in advance and most categorically any commentaries directed against the Russian Communist Party, so you can already tell that he is kinda annoyed. People have told him that, Eastman said something stupid. Then another quote, Eastman arrives at conclusions directed entirely against our party, which are likely, if given credence, to discredit the party as well as the Soviet government. Third quote, the bourgeois press, especially the Menshevik press, makes use of Eastman's statements, quotes from his reminiscences, in order to emphasize his quote-unquote close relations, his quote-unquote friendship with me as my biographer, and by such indirect means attaching an importance to his conclusions which they do not and cannot have. So let's recap. So Trotsky distances himself from Eastman, saying that they were actually never very close and that they weren't really even friends, and that Eastman's conclusions don't have and cannot have any importance, which is kind of brutal, you know, kind of pretty harsh criticism, and that his conclusions are basically anti-Soviet lies directed against the Russian Communist Party, which are likely, if given credence, to discredit the party as well as the Soviet government. Flat out, completely, like, says that everything the guy said is bullshit. Strangely enough, like 3 years later, he praised Eastman. This is what he says. This is from Trotsky on Max Eastman, 1928. Quote, "I receive your inquiry about Comrade Eastman, who is played up from time as a bogey by our press, being almost depicted as a hireling of the bourgeoisie, selling it the state secrets of the USSR. This is a shameless lie. Comrade Eastman is an American revolutionist of the John Reed type, a devoted friend of the October Revolution." So quite a different tone of voice there. So let's get back to his original statement. So this is from 1925 again. Quote, "Eastman's quotation from the wording of the quote-unquote testament, because it wasn't really a testament, is equally wrong. This was published in the Sozialistische Vestnik and was stolen from the party archives, so to speak, by counter-revolutionists. In reality, the wording as published in the Vestnik passed through many hands before its appearance in this paper. It was quote-unquote freshened up again and again and distorted to such an extent that it's absolutely impossible to restore its original meaning. It is possible that the alterations were made by the editorial staff of this paper." End of quote. So in 1925, Trotsky pointed out that the letters to Congress were actually not a testament at all, but merely letters of advice. He also pointed out that after Eastman leaked the contents to the bourgeois newspapers, they've been distorted beyond belief, and distorted so much that it's impossible to restore their original meaning, and they've been used against the Soviet government. So keep that in mind. In contrast, this is what he says in 1928. Quote, "There was nothing at all underhanded in such a utilization by Eastman of newspapers for the sake of publicity. Even on the pages of a bourgeois newspaper, the testament of Lenin's remains Lenin's testament." So suddenly he didn't see anything wrong at all with releasing the letters for the bourgeois press to distort. In fact, he doesn't even mention that they were distorted at all. I mean, he says the opposite. He says that even on the pages of the bourgeois newspapers, it's still the same thing. Also notice that while previously he said that the letters were not a testament of any kind, now he himself uses the word testament without quotation marks, because previously he used quotation marks to indicate that it's actually not a testament. Trotsky continues, this is from 1928, quote, "Desiring at any cost to give the widest possible publicity to Lenin's testament," so again using the word testament, he's literally calling it Lenin's testament. I mean, it's kind of incredible. "Eastman handed it over to an American bourgeois newspaper. Every one of us, both before and during the epoch of the Soviet government, has had more than one occasion to resort to foreign bourgeois newspapers in order to give one bit of news or another the wide circulation which we could otherwise not obtain. Lenin on more than one occasion utilized such publicity in the form of interviews given to foreign journalists." He basically goes on to say that it was correct for Eastman to do this because Lenin gave interviews to foreign newspapers, which interviews to foreign newspapers is, in Trotsky's mind, apparently the same as leaking confidential documents about inter-party affairs to bourgeois newspapers, which, to quote Trotsky himself, is so much altered as to be almost unrecognizable, and use them to, quote, discredit the party as well as the Soviet government. So now all of a sudden he thinks it's just fine that Eastman did that. So here's some more. Trotsky in 1925 again. Eastman asserts in several places that the Central Committee has quote-unquote concealed a large number of documents of extraordinary importance written by Lenin during the last period of his life. The documents in question are letters on the national question, the famous quote-unquote testament, etc. This is pure slander against the Central Committee of our party. Eastman's words convey the impression that Lenin wrote these letters, which are of an advisory character and deal with the inner party organization, with the intention of having them published. This is not at all in accordance with the facts. He continues, Eastman's assertions that the Central Committee confiscated my pamphlets and articles in 1923 or 1924, or at any time, or by any other means has prevented their publications, are untrue and are based on fantastic rumors. Eastman is again wrong in asserting that Comrade Lenin offered me the post of chairman of the Council of People's Commissars and the Council of Labor and Defense. I heard this for the first time from Eastman's book. You know, he's basically saying that Eastman is just basically inventing a whole bunch of just ridiculous crap. And again, note, he says the party didn't conceal anything. He says that it wasn't a testament, it was a series of letters which were purely advisory in character, and that they were not meant to be published at all. He continues, during his illness, Lenin repeatedly addressed letters and proposals to the leading bodies and congresses of the party. It must be definitely stated that all these letters and suggestions were invariably delivered to the destination, and they were all brought to the knowledge of the delegates to the 12th and 13th Congress, because, you know, they were called letters to Congress because that's what they were, letters to the Bolshevik Congresses, which were meant to be read publicly in the Congresses, which they were. He continues, and have invariably exercised their influence on the decisions of the party. If all of these letters have not been published, it is because their author did not intend them to be published. Comrade Lenin has not left any testament. The character of his relations to the party and the character of the party itself preclude the possibility of such a testament. The bourgeois and Menshevik press generally understand under the designation of a quote-unquote testament one of Comrade Lenin's letters, which is so much altered as to be almost unrecognizable, in which he gives the party some organizational advice. The 13th Party Congress devoted the greatest attention to this and to the other letters and drew the appropriate conclusions. All talk with regard to a concealed or mutilated quote-unquote testament is nothing but a despicable lie directed against the real will of Comrade Lenin and against the interest of the party created by him. So that's Trotsky. That is Trotsky speaking, remember that. So here Trotsky adequately points out the same thing that was said by everyone else in the Soviet Union at the time. The letters to Congress were specifically addressed to the party Congress and not meant to be published, and there was no conspiracy to conceal anything. However, 3 years later he says that they were hidden and banned by Stalinist censorship, and he was demanding that they should be published, even though previously he said that, you know, it would be going against Lenin's will to publish them. So this is what he says in 1928. Quote, Stalinist censorship had placed a ban on Lenin's testament, end of quote. While previously Trotsky said that he was not close with Eastman or a friend of Eastman, and that Eastman was spreading anti-Soviet, anti-party falsehoods, 3 years later he began praising Eastman as an irreproachable revolutionist, a friend and supporter of the October Revolution, and of the Trotskyist opposition. So this is Trotsky on Eastman in 1928. He, which means Eastman, is a poet, writer, and a journalist. He came to the Soviet Republic during the initial difficult years of her existence, learned the Russian language here, and came into intimate contact with our internal life in order to defend better and with greater assurance the Soviet Republic before the national masses of America. Another quote, Eastman is an absolutely irreproachable revolutionist, end of quote. And then third one, to the extent that news has reached me about Eastman for the last year, he remains right now what he has been, a friend of the October Revolution and a supporter of the views of the opposition. So, there you have it. Judge for yourselves. I mean, only the most naive and ignorant could actually believe Trotsky's fairy tales. I mean, he was nothing but a despicable liar and a tool of the right-wing anti-communist and anti-Soviet propaganda. I mean, this is probably the most ridiculous shit I've ever seen. I mean, how can somebody... Yeah, it just kind of makes me speechless. He's lying so much that it's completely ridiculous. So, anyway, the blog post should be in the description, and it has all the sources, everything. It's everything, all of this stuff is easily available. Lenin's letters to Congress, they're all available. Trotsky's letters about Eastman, they're both available. Even what Lenin's sister said, that's also available. And what Krupskaya said, you know, the errors of Trotskyism is, and why the Second International is defending Trotsky. Everything, all of that stuff is easily accessible. You can check all of them out. But anyway, that's it for this video, and kind of long, but there was, you know, lots of quotes, lots of stuff to cover, so kind of had to be this way. Okay, bye bye.